In the early winter of 1944, as the German High Command braced for the inevitable Allied invasion of Western Europe, a critical strategic debate erupted within the walls of the Reich Chancellery. Historically, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was focused on reinforcing the Atlantic Wall, pouring concrete, and laying millions of mines along the beaches of Normandy and Pas-de-Calais. However, Reich Minister of Armaments Albert Speer recognized a fatal flaw in this defensive philosophy. He observed that the German plan for denying the Allies a deep-water port was entirely reactive. Under current orders, German garrisons were instructed to destroy harbour facilities only at the last possible moment, when enemy troops were already breaching the city gates. Speer argued that this was a catastrophic compromise. Allied engineering units, backed by the immense industrial output of the United States, possessed unprecedented salvage capabilities. If the surrounding city, its local labor pool, its housing, and its material stockpiles were left intact, the Allies would quickly rebuild any destroyed docks. To solve this, Speer proposed a radical and ruthless solution: Operation Wüstenhafen, or Desert Port. This preemptive scorched-earth decree demanded the total and systematic destruction of every port along the northern coast of France months before any invasion occurred. Speer personally presented this plan to Adolf Hitler in January 1944, using detailed scale models of Cherbourg and Brest to demonstrate how a preemptive strike on maritime infrastructure would render the ports permanently useless. Hitler, obsessed with absolute defensive measures, enthusiastically signed the decree. Immediately, German pioneer battalions and Organisation Todt workers were redeployed to the coast. They did not wait for the Allies to land. Equipped with massive stockpiles of industrial explosives, they began the methodical demolition of the heavy infrastructure that was hardest to replace. Giant gantry cranes, massive steel lock gates, dry docks, and high-capacity pumping machinery were systematically detonated and reduced to twisted metal. Every harbour from Brest to Calais was targeted, ensuring that the Allies would face a barren coastline with no functional port facilities when the invasion finally began. By stripping the ports of their vital mechanical core long before a single Allied soldier set foot in France, Speer intended to shatter the very foundations of the Allied invasion plan, turning the liberation of Europe into a logistical nightmare that would bleed the Anglo-American forces dry. The true devastating genius of Operation Wüstenhafen lay not in the destruction of the docks, but in the systematic levelling of the surrounding port cities. Under Albert Speer's ruthless directive, German forces treated the historic port cities of Cherbourg, Brest, and Le Havre not as positions to be defended, but as logistical resources to be completely erased. German pioneer battalions systematically went block by block through residential neighbourhoods, commercial districts, and municipal zones, planting heavy explosives in every building. Over the course of several months, thousands of homes, hotels, administrative offices, and warehouses were reduced to flat fields of smoking rubble. This total destruction was calculated to inflict a series of insurmountable bottlenecks on the Allied invasion force. First, it completely eliminated the local civilian labour force. Historically, the Allies relied on thousands of French dock workers, carpenters, and engineers to clear and rebuild captured ports. Under Operation Wüstenhafen, the destruction of their homes forced the entire civilian population to flee into the interior of France as refugees, leaving the coast empty. Second, the levelling of the cities destroyed the billeting and administrative network. Allied salvage crews had no buildings to occupy, forcing them to live in muddy, exposed encampments, which drastically lowered productivity. Third, the collapse of thousands of stone and brick structures choked every road and railway line with millions of tons of heavy debris. Before any salvage equipment could reach the docks, Allied bulldozers had to spend weeks carving narrow paths through mountains of rubble. Finally, the demolition of warehouses destroyed massive stockpiles of timber, cement, and structural steel that the Allies historically confiscated to repair the docks. Every single nail, plank, and bag of concrete had to be shipped across the English Channel, completely stalling the reconstruction schedule. By transforming these vibrant maritime centres into barren, rocky deserts, the Germans turned the capture of any French harbour into a hollow victory, denying the Allies the essential urban infrastructure required to sustain a modern mechanised army. While German pioneer battalions levelled the coastal cities, the Kriegsmarine executed a massive maritime blockade to seal the approaches to northern France. Hundreds of outdated, captured and decommissioned merchant vessels were scuttled as block ships in every narrow navigation channel, turning basin and harbour mouth. These block ships were filled with cement and reinforced with heavy iron girders, creating solid, immovable barrier reefs. To prevent Allied salvage vessels from approaching these obstructions, the Germans launched an intensive aerial and submarine mine-laying campaign, sowing thousands of advanced magnetic, acoustic, and pressure-sensitive sea mines in the harbour entrances. This multi-layered defence forced the Allies to rely entirely on their revolutionary artificial harbours, the Mulberry Harbours. Historically, two Mulberries were constructed, Mulberry A at Omaha Beach and Mulberry B at Arromanches. However, this absolute reliance on artificial ports left the Allied supply chain highly vulnerable to the unpredictable weather of the English Channel. Between June 19th and June 22nd, 1944, a severe and completely unexpected summer storm hit the Normandy coast, representing the worst Channel gale in 40 years. Historically, this storm heavily damaged the floating roadways and concrete caissons of Mulberry A at Omaha Beach, forcing the Americans to abandon it and pivot to landing supplies directly onto the open sand. In our alternative timeline, with all deep water ports completely obliterated and sealed under Operation Wüstenhafen, the destruction of Mulberry A becomes an unmitigated logistical catastrophe. The Allies have no fallback option, no sheltered harbour, and no way to bypass the storm's devastation, leaving their entire beachhead supply line hanging by a thread as millions of tons of seawater smash the fragile metal bridges to pieces. This violent gale did not just wreck the artificial harbour, it effectively severed the tenuous logistical link between Great Britain and the European continent, leaving the Allied armies stranded on the beaches with a rapidly depleting stockpile of food, fuel and ammunition. With Mulberry destroyed and all continental ports reduced to pulverised rubble, the Allied logistical build-up in Normandy grinds to a sudden and terrifying halt. The US forces are forced to pivot entirely to landing fuel, ammunition, and replacement vehicles directly onto the open sand of Omaha and Utah beaches. However, without the shelter of an artificial harbour, the daily supply intake drops by over 70%. The Allied armies find themselves dangerously short of artillery ammunition, tank replacement parts, and fuel, leaving them vulnerable to a coordinated German counterattack in the rugged Bocage countryside. The planned breakout from Normandy, historically executed as Operation Cobra in late July 1944, is rendered logistically impossible, trapping millions of Anglo-American soldiers in a narrow, muddy beachhead. This severe logistical paralysis completely reshapes the strategic outcome of the Second World War. Trapped in a grinding battle of attrition in Normandy, the Western Allies are forced to watch as the Soviet Red Army launches its massive summer offensive, Operation Bagration, in the east. Operating with no significant Western breakout to divert German armoured reserves, the Soviet steamroller advances relentlessly through Poland and East Prussia, reaching the borders of Germany by late 1944. The war in Europe ends not with a joint Allied advance and the liberation of Berlin from two sides, but with the Red Army occupying the entirety of Germany, Austria, and Central Europe. The Western Allies are left with only a minor, highly costly foothold on the coast of France, permanently shifting the geopolitical balance of the post-war world and demonstrating that Albert Speer's ruthless, systematic scorched earth policy was the single most devastating weapon the Germans could have deployed to defeat the Normandy invasion, rendering the massive industrial sacrifices of D-Day entirely futile in the face of absolute logistical denial.